The recycled air of the cabin carried a particular hush at cruise, a white static made of engine hum and pressurized breath, and somewhere under it came the slow rasp of an old man sleeping in 22F, each breath dragging in like a drawer that didn't want to open. What does the old man in 22F keep touching in his breast pocket every time the engine note changes, long before anything is wrong? Nobody had asked that yet. What they had done, 40 minutes earlier at the jet bridge, was watch Whitney Prescott glance at his boarding pass, glance at him, and say, not unkindly, but not kindly either, "Sir, we can get you a wheelchair if you need more time. No rush, but let's not hold up the line." The way you'd speak to a slow child or a stalled cart. He is 76 years old. There are 148 souls on this airplane. In 53 minutes, there will be 0 working flight instruments in the cockpit and 40 minutes of fuel left to find a runway with none of them. Nobody on Meridian Skyways. Flight 884 knows yet what the folded paper wheel in his shirt pocket is for, or why his thumb finds its cracked leather sleeve every time the pitch of the engines changes, the way another man might finger a rosary or a coin worn smooth. If you've ever been the one everyone assumed had nothing left to give, type steady in the comments. He had boarded last, moving with the unhurried care of a man who has made peace with gravity, one hand trailing the seatback tops for balance, and he had said nothing to Whitney beyond "much obliged" in a voice gone soft with age, the kind of voice that apologizes for its own volume. He'd found 22F without help, folded himself into it with a small grunt, and was asleep before the safety demonstration finished, chin dropped, breath rasping steady as a slow bellows. What no one watching him doze away the boarding announcements could have known was that this same unremarkable-looking man had flown paying passengers across 3 mountain ranges and 1 ocean for 40 years, that he had held the yoke of aircraft with dials instead of screens, needles instead of glass, and that the instrument he trusted most had never needed batteries. What no one could have known either was that in less than an hour, every modern instrument on this airplane would go dark at once, and the only functioning navigation system left aboard would be sitting quietly in coach, wearing a feed co-op cap bleached the color of old bone, dreaming, for now, of nothing anyone else could see. The tremor was easiest to notice in the boarding line, a fine shiver in his right hand as he'd passed his ticket across, the kind of shake people's eyes slide past and file under old, under fragile, under nothing to see here. Up close, it told a different story. His knuckles were broad as walnuts, the calluses along his palm ridged in a pattern no desk job leaves behind. And when his hand closed, around the armrest, around a coffee cup, around anything with purpose, the shiver stopped as cleanly as a switch thrown. He wore a canvas barn coat gone the soft brown of a plowed field, a flannel shirt worn thin and pale at both elbows, and that bleached cap folded now in his lap like a resting animal. In the breast pocket of the flannel, beneath the coat, rode a shape no bigger than a paperback, wrapped in a leather sleeve, cracked along its spine into a network of fine white lines, like a riverbed seen from altitude. At pushback, when the engine spooled and the whole airframe took on its low shudder of intent, his hand had gone to that pocket without any decision behind it, thumb pressing once against the leather the way another man checks that his wallet hasn't wandered. Kendra Ledbetter, 34, in scrubs from a 12-hour shift she hadn't yet washed off, sat in 22 de put it E, watching her grandfather's hand settle back into his lap. "You don't have to do that every time we push back, Grandpa," she said, not really expecting an answer, because he never had one that satisfied her. "Habit," he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth, the way most things he said were. Under his breath, so low she nearly missed it beneath the engine whine, he was humming. 3 notes, then a 4th that bent up at the end like a question, over and over, a hymn tune with no words attached that he seemed to reach for the way another man reaches for a cigarette. Kendra had heard it her whole life without ever asking its name. She knew only that her grandmother used to hum it too, in the kitchen, over dishes, and that some years after Estelle passed, Harlan had picked the tune up himself, quietly, as if he'd been keeping it in trust until someone needed to carry it. "You always do that on takeoff," she said. "The humming." "Something your grandmother used to do," he said, eyes still closed. "Dispatchers hum. Didn't know that, did you? She hummed the whole tower to sleep some nights." He almost smiled. I picked up bad habits from a woman who never sat in a cockpit in her life. Must have been a good habit if you kept it. The good ones are the ones you don't notice you're doing, he said, and folded his hands and let the tremor start up again now that there was nothing yet worth closing his fist around. Up front, behind a door with a keypad and a strip of amber light, Captain Burrell's soul ran his checklist in the flat, unbothered cadence of a man who has done this 10,000 times, calling out fuel, flaps, pressurization, each item answered and closed like a lock turning. He was 52, built solid through the shoulders, and he flew the way some men mow a lawn, without drama, without waste. The airplane an extension of an unremarkable competence he'd earned the hard way over 3 decades. 3 rows back in coach, in 14C, an off-duty first officer named Brooke Sinclair was explaining to her seatmate, with the easy fluency of someone who loved her own expertise, how the airplane's flight management computer would fly a smoother descent than any human hand ever could. Everything's coupled now, she said. Auto throttle, autopilot, flight director. The human's really just a systems monitor at cruise. She was 41, glass cockpit trained from her first day of ground school, and she said it the way people say true things they've never had to test. Whitney Prescott came down the aisle with the blanket cart, professionally warm, and stopped at 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Can I get you a blanket, sir? Cabin gets cool up here. She didn't wait for an answer before tucking one across his knees, then crouched to point at the seatback card. In the unlikely event, exits are here, and at the tail. The vest inflates like this, see the tab. She mimed the pull, patient as a schoolteacher, her voice pitched half a register higher than the one she used on the rest of the row. I've flown a few of these, Harlan said, not unkindly, nodding once at the card. Appreciate the blanket. 2 rows back, a man murmured to his wife, just loud enough to travel. Bless his heart, hope the old-timer doesn't need that vest, and laughed low, and his wife hushed him without much conviction. Harlan didn't turn around. He only closed his hand once around the folded blanket's edge, tremor stopping dead the instant his fingers found something to hold, and went back to watching the wing outside his window with the calm, unhurried attention of a man reading weather nobody else in the cabin had thought yet to check. 53 minutes in, the smell arrived before anything else did. A thin, acrid thread of hot plastic, the kind of smell that doesn't belong anywhere near a cabin, curling up through the recirculated air like a rumor before the fact. A half-second later, the whole fuselage gave one hard, wrong shudder, a shiver that traveled the frame like a shiver travels a horse's flank. Somewhere behind the cockpit door, something popped, small and final, like a fuse giving up. Harlan was already leaning forward before the seatbelt sign chimed on, elbows on his knees, head tilted a fraction toward the front of the aircraft, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The way a man counts thunder after lightning to measure the distance to a storm. The engine note had changed. He knew that sound in his back teeth before his ears had fully caught up to it. A half-tone drop that had nothing to do with thrust and everything to do with something drawing power it shouldn't. Around him, the cabin came apart in the ordinary ways cabins come apart. A gasp 2 rows up, a child crying without knowing why, a man in 19A gripping both armrests as if the plastic could steady the world. Whitney's voice cracked once over the PA. Please remain seated. We are addressing a please remain seated, before losing the thread of her own script entirely. Kendra grabbed her grandfather's forearm, more reflex than plan. What she found under her hand surprised her more than the smell had. No tremor. His arm was steady as a beam, muscle set, breathing slow and even while hers had gone shallow and fast. Grandpa? Electrical, he said, quiet, almost to himself, still counting seconds on some internal ledger only he could read. Avionics bay, most likely. Give it a minute. His hand had already found the leather sleeve in his breast pocket, thumb resting there, not gripping, just resting. The way a man's hand finds a doorframe in the dark. He wasn't afraid. Kendra realized it the way you realize a room has gone quiet, not all at once, but as an absence she couldn't stop noticing, spreading outward from the stillness of his hands into everything else about him, his eyes tracking the ceiling panels, his jaw unclenched, a man listening to an engine the way other men listen to rain. The cockpit door burst open 11 seconds later on a thread of gray smoke and the sour tang of burned insulation. Captain Burrell Soule stumbled half a step into the aisle, one forearm blistered red and already swelling, his other hand pressed flat against the frame to keep himself upright, eyes glassy with the particular disorientation of a man whose instruments have just gone dark in front of him. Behind him, screens that had shown attitude and altitude and airspeed a minute ago now showed nothing but amber failure flags, or nothing at all. Whitney's hand found the PA handset like it belonged to someone else. Her voice, when it came, shook on every word. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a pilot on board, if anyone has flight experience, please identify yourself to a crew member immediately." She said it twice, the second time thinner than the first, and stood there gripping the handset with both hands, as if letting go of it might make the request untrue. Harlan Ledbetter unbuckled his belt, folded the blanket once into a neat square out of some old habit of tidiness, and stood. "My name is Harlan Ledbetter," he said to Whitney, to the aisle, to no one in particular and everyone at once, in the same unhurried voice he'd used to thank her for the blanket. "I am 76 years old. I flew for this airline for 40 years, 1969 to 2009, type-rated on this airframe's ancestor and 3 others besides." He said it the way another man might recite an address, 3 plain sentences with nothing added, and started up the aisle before anyone could decide whether to stop him. In the cockpit, Brooke Sinclair had already climbed into the right seat, fingers moving fast and useless over dead glass, trying old checklist muscle memory against a panel with nothing left alive to check. She looked up as Harlan lowered himself into the left seat beside Burrell's empty position, saw the tremor in his hand steady the instant it closed around the yoke, and said, too fast, "Sir, I'm rated on this aircraft. The FMS is completely dark. The flight director's gone. I don't have attitude. I don't have—" "I know," Harlan said. "I don't need the screens. Never learned to fly with them." He glanced at her once, not unkindly. "You're going to have to talk me through what this airplane can still tell me, and I'm going to have to talk you through the rest." Behind them, unheard by either, the cockpit voice recorder kept its patient reel turning, capturing the first exchange of a conversation that would later be replayed in a conference room 3 states away. 2 people trying to build 1 working airplane out of 40 years and 4 out of glass and paper, because between them they had exactly what the other one lacked, and neither of them yet knew if it would be enough. The wet compass swung lazily in its dome above the windshield, the one instrument in the cockpit too old and too simple to have caught fire. Harlan tapped its glass once with a fingernail, the way a man taps a barometer on the porch. "Standby airspeed's alive," Brooke said, reading the one analog gauge that had survived the surge. "That's it. That's everything we've got." Harlan reached into his breast pocket and drew out the leather sleeve, worked the folded paper wheel free of it with a thumb that no longer shook, and set it against his knee. The numbers printed on its face had gone pale as chalk, rubbed soft by 50 years of exactly this motion. "E6B, he said, mostly to himself. "Dead reckoning. Compass heading, elapsed time, known airspeed, wind correction. That's how we used to find a runway before anybody trusted a computer to do it for us." He turned the inner wheel a quarter turn, murmuring numbers, cross-checking the compass swing against a mental clock only he was keeping. "That math doesn't account for our current descent profile," Brooke said, leaning to look, some old training reflex insisting on precision even now. "We need to factor density altitude. We need a heading and a time," Harlan said, not sharply, just final. "I'll fly the airplane. You call the numbers." He glanced at the compass again. "Your training's not wrong. It's just built for an airplane that still has something to tell it. This one doesn't. So we go back to the version that never needed telling." Whitney appeared in the cockpit doorway, headset askew, voice tight. "Center's trying to send you a data link clearance. They keep saying it's not populating on their end." She stopped, understanding arriving visibly on her face. "You don't have a screen to put it on." "No," Harlan said. "Tell them voice only. Tell them slow." He didn't look up from the compass. "You're going to be my radio now. Miss Prescott. Every word twice if you have to." She keyed the handset with a hand that had stopped shaking sometime in the last 90 seconds, relaying headings and altitudes in plain, careful English to a controller on the ground who kept trying, out of habit, to push automated routing at an airplane that could no longer receive it. Below, in a windowless dispatch office 400 miles away, A duty manager named in nothing but a clipped voice on the radio was already saying the word liability before Whitney had finished her second transmission. "We cannot authorize an unlicensed civilian to assume control of that aircraft," the voice said, flat, procedural, a man reading from policy the way Whitney once had. "Get the first officer in the seat. That is our only sanctioned path forward." "The first officer is not type current on manual flight without automation," Brooke said into the radio herself, her own voice gone thin with the admission. "I am not either. I've never hand-flown anything without a flight director in my life." Nobody in the cockpit said anything for 3 long seconds, the confession sitting in the air like smoke that hadn't cleared yet. "Then somebody needs to find the authority to change your policy in about the next 4 minutes, Harlan said quietly, eyes on the compass. "Because I've got roughly 40 minutes of fuel, and I intend to spend it landing this airplane, with or without a form somebody signs." The standby airspeed needle, the one instrument that had survived the fire, began to stutter. Climbing, dropping, climbing again, a small tremor working through the glass. Brooke saw it first. "Pitot heat," she said low. "It's not getting power. That thing's going to ice over at this altitude. We're going to lose airspeed entirely." She looked at Harlan, and for the first time since she'd climbed into that seat, there was no correction in her voice, only dread confirmed. "I told them the failure cascade wasn't finished. I told the duty manager we couldn't trust what was left." "You were right," Harlan said, and there was no triumph in it, only the flat acknowledgement of a fact. "Your instruments told you the truth. They just couldn't tell you what to do about it." The needle gave one last uncertain flutter and died, frozen at a number neither of them could trust anymore. He set the paper wheel down on his knee, closed his eyes for half a second, and listened, not to the radio, not to Brooke, but to the engines themselves, the low, layered hum of thrust-through metal that he'd spent 40 years learning to read the way other men read faces. "Airspeed's in the sound now," he said, "and in the yoke. Too fast, she gets light in my hands and the note climbs. Too slow, she gets heavy and the note drops and shudders. I flew airplanes for 15 years before anybody put a computer between me and any of that." He eased the yoke a half-inch forward, feeling for the exact pressure he wanted, the tremor nowhere in sight now that his hands had real work. "Call me a number if you've got one. I'll fly you a feeling." Brooke stared at him for a long moment, then at her own dead panel, then back at his hands on the yoke, steady as stone. "I don't have anything to teach you," she said, quiet, mostly to herself. "I don't have a single instrument that beats what you're doing right now." The radio cracked to life then, a new voice replacing the dispatch manager's, older, rougher, carrying an authority the first voice hadn't had. "Meridian Flight 884. This is Austin Radcliffe, Chief Pilot, Regional Division. I'm patched in from the destination airport. Belay the previous instruction. I am authorizing hands-on control by the qualified individual in the left seat, full authority, effective immediately, and I will take responsibility for that decision personally." A pause, static breathing through it. "Whitney, is the man's name Ledbetter? Harlan Ledbetter?" "Yes, sir," Whitney said. "How did you—" "Because 31 years ago," Radcliffe said, and something in his voice caught and had to be swallowed before it could continue. "I was a 27-year-old first officer sitting where that young woman is sitting now, and a captain named Harlan Ledbetter flew me home through a hydraulic failure that should have killed us both. And I have never in 31 years stopped being grateful that man was in that seat." Another pause, shorter. "Harlan, if you can hear me, it's Austin. Steady hands, old friend, I've got you." Harlan's own hand, closing tighter around the yoke, didn't shake at all. "Austin Radcliffe," Harlan said, and something in his chest loosened for the first time since the smoke had come through the door. "You were green as spring grass and you didn't touch the controls once the whole way home. Good instincts, even scared half to death." "I remember," Radcliffe said. "Listen to me now the way I listened to you then. Weather's closing our electronic approach. You're going to have to fly this one visual, by eye, in maybe 18 more minutes of light before the ceiling drops on us both. Talk to me. Tell me what you can see." "Horizon's still holding a line," Harlan said, eyes forward, voice dropping into the register of a man narrating his own hands. "Runway's not in sight yet. Compass says we're close to the heading you gave me." Under his breath, so low that only Kendra, 3 rows back and straining forward against her belt, could hear it at all. The 4 notes started again, the tune with no name that had followed him from a kitchen 11 years empty into every cockpit he'd ever sat in since. She used to hum this on final approach, he said, mostly to himself, mostly to Estelle, wherever a person goes to keep listening. I never told her I could hear it over the engines. I heard it anyway. 10 degrees left, Radcliffe said. There, you've got the field. Runway 22 coming up on your nose. The runway arrived first as a pale seam in the gray, then as 2 long lines of lights strung out through thickening weather, and Harlan flew toward it the way he'd once told Kendra you read river current, not by looking at the water, but by looking at where the water was going. His hands made no sudden movements, small corrections, breath-timed, the yoke answering him like an old dog answering its name. Behind him, Kendra had one hand on his shoulder, not to steady him. There was nothing in him left to steady, but because she needed, in that moment, to be touching the only calm thing on the airplane. Sync rate's good, Brooke said, watching what little the dead panel would still confirm, her voice gone hushed with something closer to reverence than fear now. You're right on it. You're right on it, Captain. The hum kept going under his breath, 4 notes, then the 5th that'd been up at the end, over and over, quieter than the engines, and louder, somehow, than everything else in that cockpit. The ground rose to meet them in the last hard seconds, the way ground always does, faster than the eye wants to believe. And Harlan held the nose exactly where his hands and his ears and 31-year-old Det told him it belonged, flying by nothing but attitude and sound and a paper wheel gone soft with age, resting forgotten now against his knee. The wheels touched with one firm chirp, then a second, the airframe settling onto the runway like something exhaling after holding its breath a very long time. Reverse thrust roared, brakes bit, and the whole airplane shuddered down through its speed in a long, controlled unwinding that felt, to every soul aboard, like the world deciding to keep them after all. 148 people breathed out together, a sound with no name, somewhere between a sob and a cheer, rolling back through the cabin, row by row like a wave finding shore. Harlan Ledbetter let the aircraft roll to a stop on the taxiway, set the brake, and folded his hands in his lap, where, for the first time since the smoke had come through the cockpit door, the old tremor was allowed to come back, small and forgiven, because there was nothing left that needed his hands steady. Whitney Prescott stood in the cockpit doorway a long moment before she found words, and when they came, they weren't from any script the airline had ever printed. "Sir," she said, and had to stop and start again. "Captain, thank you." She didn't offer him a blanket this time. She offered her hand, and when he took it, hers was the one shaking. On the tarmac 40 minutes later, under floodlights and a sky finally letting rain down in earnest, Austin Radcliffe crossed from a company car at a near-run, silver-haired, 58 years old, and did not slow down until he had both arms around a man in a faded barn coat who came up several inches short of his shoulder. 31 years, Radcliffe said into the collar of that coat, voice breaking clean down the middle of the word. 31 years I've been hoping I'd get the chance to say thank you properly, and you go and make me say it over a radio instead. You said it fine, Harlan told him. Inside the terminal, an hour after that, a Meridian regional director began outlining, for the assembled cameras, a statement heavy with the phrase crew resource management, until Radcliffe took the podium himself, unasked, and read out 3 names instead. Burl Soule, who had held command until his body physically could not. Brooke Sinclair, who had told dispatch the truth about the instruments when it would have been easier to stay quiet. And Harlan Ledbetter, 76, 40 years a captain for this airline, who had simply gotten out of 22F and gone to work. This airplane came down safely, Radcliffe said, because 3 people refused to let a policy be more honest than they were. Harlan, standing at the back of the room in his bleached feed co-op cap, asked for nothing when the reporters turned toward him, only that the commendation carry Burl's name and Brooks above his own, and then he asked quietly if someone could find his granddaughter a cup of coffee, because she'd been on her feet the whole flight, and nobody had thought to ask if she was tired. The kettle on Harlan Ledbetter's stove had just begun its low, rising whistle on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months later, October light coming flat and gold through the kitchen window the way it does only for a few weeks a year. On the table beside a chipped teacup lay the E6B wheel, folded shut in its cracked leather sleeve, resting the way a tool rests when its work for the day is finished. Tucked under the sleeve's flap, corners just visible, was a photograph Kendra had taken from the tarmac that evening. The airplane, the rain, the small, stooped figure of her grandfather walking away from it under floodlights, looking in the picture like nothing more than an old man heading home from an ordinary day. Some debts fly quiet for 31 years before they land. Harlan reached over, turned the burner down, and hummed the 4 notes in the 5th that bent up at the end, low under his breath, the way he had every day for 11 years, and would, most likely, for as many more as he was given, and the kitchen held the sound the way it had always held it, gently, and asked for nothing back.